Hey everyone, in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Romain Basset back on the show, and today we're going to be talking about the Olympic Games that are coming up in France. Now, the Olympic Games are always an interesting time, not just for the sports, but also for geopolitics and, surprisingly, cybersecurity. So Romain and I are going to talk about the Olympics from a cybersecurity perspective. What types of cyber attacks have we seen on Olympic Games in the past? What are we likely to see in this year's Olympic Games? And lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got Romain Basset with me. How's it going, Romain?
Hey, hi, Andy. I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, this is your second time on the show, so I'm glad to have you back. You're a wealth of knowledge and insight in the security area, so happy to have you here, my friend.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm happy to be back, and hello, everyone.
Definitely. And so, being this is just your second time, why don't you give us a quick introduction of yourself and what you do for Hornetsecurity?
Sure. Thanks, Andy. So I'm responsible for technology and strategy, so I'm here to talk to our partners and customers about our product, our technologies, and also our analysts' work, what they see about the threat landscape and the threat actors, which I think we're going to talk about today.
It should be a good discussion. It's a topic that's top of mind for a lot of people, and of course, we're talking about the Olympics, right? And the cybersecurity around the Olympics, I guess. And it's funny, if you would have told me 10, 15, 20 years ago that we'd be having a cybersecurity discussion focused specifically on the Olympics, I'd be like, Really?
What?
Huh? Like what?
Yeah.
And I guess maybe that's a good place for us to start, is kind of digging into that question, is like, why do we even have to have a cybersecurity around the Olympics, right? And I think it comes down to the current world environment, right? And so there's a couple of things that play into this, right? We've got one, the Olympics is a global thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a global stage, the whole world is watching, and you're particularly close to the Olympics this year because you're French, and it's based in Paris this year, right? So that's I guess it's close to home for you with that in mind, right?
Yeah, and it's been like a century last time France hosted the Olympics, so everyone is pretty excited about it. And yes, as you were saying, it's putting the country hosted the events like on the world stage for everyone to be watching it. So quite a lot of that is at stake.
For sure. And so when we think about, again, other world events that are kind of going on, the one thing that kind of comes top of mind here, and I'm not trying to single out or pick on Russia here, but Russian threat actors are a known quantity, right? And they have been, at least as of this recording, I know Russia has been banned from the games for a couple of years now. I remember it was, I want to say 2016. I'm not, a big Olympics historian by any stretch of the imagination. So folks watching, feel free to correct me if needed. But if I remember correctly, it was 2016 they were banned from the games due to doping allegations, right? And I believe that ban stands today. So they're not even allowed in the games. So you have that. You have Russian nation-state threat actors being a thing. You've got the whole situation with Israel and Palestine going on. You've got the war in Ukraine. There are other world events. I mean, Iran is, frequently causing mischief, I guess I would say. I don't know. Is there anything that comes to mind for you, Romain, that's in terms of world events that may play a role in this?
No, you're right, Andy. And, without going over the entire list, certainly what we can observe, there is the conflict between China and Taiwan. There are even some conflicts between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And while those are real life tensions, I shouldn't have said conflict, should have said tension rather, they have repercussions from the real world into the digital world. And threat actors, hacktivists do use these or are fueled by these to carry out their malicious actions. So, yes, this is the world we're living in right now, indeed.
Right. I mean, it does feel like at least here in the States, we would call it a tinder box, right? It's a box with a
Mm,
bunch of flammable material in it that's just ready to.
indeed.
And
Yeah.
so when we think about the Olympics being kind of this global stage, right? I mean, it's the perfect platform, I guess I would say, for threat actors to take advantage of, whether that's for
Yeah.
hacktivism, like you mentioned, or financial gain, or just to cause problems, right? And so, I, being in cybersecurity, we always bring it down to risks, right? What's the risk? And so, I guess there's a couple of different ways you could look at this, and I'd be interested to get your take on this, Roman. Right? I can look at this from an attendee perspective. You know, I'm an individual and I've made the
Yeah.
decision to go to the games, right? Or watch them or whatever, right? But you can look at this from a country perspective too. You know, if I mean, it's especially close for you because you're French
Yes.
and it's in Paris, right? So I mean, there's certainly a country aspect of the cybersecurity for the games itself. And then, I mean, there's also that geopolitical, and we don't get into geopolitics typically on this show, but there's that aspect of it as well.
No, I agree. I mean, I guess if anything, the Olympics is one of the few examples where you would have all sorts of hackers from all around the world, like saying, "Hey, this is an opportunity for me." So back to your point, you can really like go from the low class cyber criminals slash scammers. They're going to take advantage of that with the ticket scams. You're going to have that with Taylor Swift concerts, right? But you also
Right.
have that with the Olympics. What you don't have with Taylor Swift tickets is activism or um, data leaks or ransomware attacks that are going to use the Olympics as the backdrop to bring credibility to whomever they're targeting.
Right.
And also to go back to another point you mentioned, whether it is sabotage, destabilization, cyber espionage, even to some extent, um, based on the tensions and the conflicts we were talking earlier, and the country hosting the Olympics being at the forefront, it's I don't want to say the perfect recipe, but kind of is the perfect recipe. If I want to destabilize a country, everyone is looking at it, and
Right.
I, as a threat actor, I disagree with this country's politics. That's the moment I would want to strike, and there have been instances in the past of that uh, type of attacks.
Right. Definitely. And I've actually got that on our list, but we'll get to that in a second. So there's
Sure.
we've talked about the potential for scams. So I think about what that looks like from an individual perspective, right? I'm going to start seeing emails, and I'm sure we've started seeing emails about this, like,
Yes.
"Hey, you won the 2024 drawing for free tickets to the Olympics. Congratulations! Click here to get your tickets." Right, that type of
Yeah.
thing.
VIP pass.
Exactly. Right. So we've got that
Yeah.
going on. I'm sure there are. Um, uh, what why can't I think of the words, Andy? The one thing I'm thinking of is when you have nonprofit organizations that are putting forward money for good causes to
Oh yeah.
either get.
Raising funds. Yeah.
Right, correct, exactly. Getting people to the Olympics or raising awareness for positive things at the Olympics. Right, you
Mm,
have your
charity.
exactly. Yes, thank you. That's the word I'm thinking of. The charity scams. Those of that watch the
That's
show
true.
regularly know that Andy has the occasional brain fart like that, and hopefully they are few and far between. But anyway, yes, charity scams. That's what I was thinking of. And so, yeah, I'm sure the ecosystem is ripe for that as well. Extortion. And we're going to talk about the Pyeongchang 2018 Olympics here in a second. But if I'm a threat actor and I know that there's this world stage event going on, like the opening ceremony for the Olympic Games, if
Mm.
I can gain foothold into the IT systems of like an opening ceremony, that's ripe for extortion, right? Like, hey, pay us money or we're going to cause all kinds of
Yeah.
issues for you, type of thing, right? So we've talked about the individual level, we've talked about the risks of the games themselves, and then you mentioned earlier also the disinformation, the destabilization aspect of it as
Yeah.
well too. And so that's when your nation state threat actor groups are going to, you know, come into the mix, right? Which I think is that's a nice segue into the Pyongyang 2018 games, and hopefully I'm saying that correctly. I'm fairly certain I am, but the point is we've seen this happen before, right? We've
Yes.
seen this type of attack happen before. We've seen these risks. Um, it was during the opening ceremony of the 2018 games in Pyongyang where internet access was impacted, ticket printing was impacted. Basically, there was a massive cyber attack as the opening ceremony was starting.
Mm.
And I was reading up about this. They were able to get out in front of it, and it didn't cause too many issues. The opening
Indeed.
ceremony went on as planned, but that is the primary cause for. If you look at recordings, there were quite a few empty seats, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, you know, again, looking at geopolitics, and I'm by no stretch of the imagination an expert on geopolitics, but if I'm some, if I'm a nation state who wants to cause troubles, I can use that to. They can use it to their advantage in terms of disinformation, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
look, the games were sparsely attended, and they can use it for that geopolitical stuff, right? They can make a statement with
Indeed.
it.
Absolutely. You could, say, hey, that country is not even capable of hosting, a ceremony. So, why should they have a voice on the international scene? Just really to cause destabilization, as you were saying. I think what was really interesting with that particular attempt was that it was, I wouldn't say the first one, but certainly the most visible one, which had an impact, albeit limited, but still had an impact. And that's one thing, too. The magnitude and the effort, right? It took place in February of 2018.
Right.
Reconnaissance took place much earlier.
Right.
Apparently, the first infection was in December of 2017. So there was a lot of patience on the hacker side. And the third point is obviously, from my perspective, the most interesting one was all the false flags that were planted in, the malicious code
Right.
that was later analyzed, because that showed the level of effort by the cyber criminals to really hide their tracks, which had not been seen prior to that hack. That was really a new magnitude, and everybody got, scratching their head at some point back then.
Right. And that's one of the things I wanted to make sure we talked about was the false flag operations going on with
Yes.
that particular attack. And I know the Lazarus group, like they did a lot of the actual threat actors laid a lot of groundwork to make it look like other groups were responsible. For example, the Lazarus group was one of the groups that they tried to false flag. I know there was a couple other nation state threat actor groups
Yeah.
that were pointed at. I know that the real culprit was suspected to be Russian nation state threat actors because there was some metadata containing an IP
Yeah.
address that was known to be used in other ongoing attacks, including attacks happening against Ukrainian infrastructure. And so it looks like that is who the actual threat actor was. But of course, in these things, you never quite 100% know for sure, right?
Yeah.
So,
That that particular aspect is really like it's almost like a spy book or a spy movie because
yeah.
and I really encourage the audience to read like the article from Wired on the topic because it really is some sort of crazy investigation. But to your point on that part about like the attribution, um, there were so many false flags, so some targeting of China based on the code, and that threat researcher, I think he was from FireEye, that he had the idea to actually not look at the code anymore and go back to the malicious attachment as this was initially based on an email attachment, right, a Word file, to go through the metadata, find an IP address and had this apparently photographic memory and say, hey, I've seen that IP address before. And as you were saying, he had seen this for related to an attack targeting Ukraine, and at an earlier stage even tied to a phishing attempt targeting U.S. citizens for the 2016 elections. So
Right.
he managed to connect the dots eventually and made the fairly strong assumption that a Russian threat actor was behind it. Was later confirmed, not directly, but by U.S. services, that they were suspecting Russia as well. But the whole story of how could it be North Korea, could it be some well-known Chinese threat actors, and eventually could it be, Russian threat actors? That's some sort of crazy trail to follow. And once again, if we pose, because we all get excited, but like to think about that at some point somebody had the idea to likely plant those false flags in the code, similarities in the code, to say, all right, I'm going to make it as hard as possible for anybody to find out that it was us behind it. It shows the magnitude of the state-sponsored cybercriminal attacks we're seeing these days. And back to the initial topic as well, like, yeah, the Olympics, they have a pretty big target on their back, right? Because if you can impact them, then the visibility, the magnitude of your attack is 10 times bigger than what it would be in any other circumstance.
Right. For sure. And I thinking about again the risks and the impact of these types of attacks, just the false flags themselves creates, I guess, what I would call international chaos, right? Because now
Yeah,
you have
good point.
countries potentially blaming each other, and
Yeah,
that, I mean, typically it's always just saber rattling is what we would call it here in the US, right? But I mean, there is a hidden cost to that in international relations,
indeed.
right? And so I mean, again, getting a little bit, like you said, it's like a spy movie almost, right? But
Mm,
this is the result of a cyber attack, and so that's kind of
yeah.
where the tie-in with our cybersecurity discussion, right? So it's again, we don't typically get into geopolitics on this show, but it's just interesting analyzing the impact from a cybersecurity perspective, right? So,
Yes, absolutely.
and so that brings us back to France and the games that are coming up here at the end of this month, right? And so, I mean, one thing that I find interesting, and you kind of alluded to this when we were talking about the conversation about Pyongyang and the 2018 games, is that attacks were happening leading up to those games, right? And the same thing is
Yeah.
happening with France now. If I have read correctly, I know that there's been a lot of DDoS stuff going on.
Yes.
Lulsec, for example, Anonymous Sudan. There's been multiple threat actor groups involved in
Yeah.
attacking French infrastructure already, right?
Yeah, yeah, indeed, and it's it's always hard to put a number on it because in general cyber attacks they're always on the rise, unfortunately. So it's hard to say, okay, it is because of this particular event that we're seeing an increase, but for sure, and there's some sort of a consensus among vendors or MSPs, cybersecurity specialists saying that yeah, we are seeing an increase ahead of the Olympics. It's likely due to the Olympics. Everyone's a little bit, on the edge. Everyone is trying to tighten up their security, awareness of the end users about the specific context. So definitely there are some added risks. And now, if you add to that box as well, but there are some major elections everywhere in the world, in the US at the end of the year. Right, so I think there's going to be some in the UK. Probably it will be before the episode is released, but like around
Yeah.
July as well. We have some in France as well, and some also have implication, in the global geopolitical scale. So, back to the Olympics, we're seeing destabilization, we're seeing fake news. From that same token, we're seeing the same for these elections as well. So yes, there's an increase of attack, an increase in fake news, misinformation, and it's likely we're going to see that in US and UK as well because of the elections. Unfortunately, should I say?
It's interesting. It used to be, if I go back a couple of years, even more than a couple of years, if I go back, it used to be I had two separate boxes. And this box over here, we had cyber attacks. right? That's your typical threat actors trying to get rich, running
Yeah.
scams, hacking information, ransomware, that type of thing, right? And then over here we had disinformation, political destabilization.
Hmm.
It used to feel like, and maybe this is just my perception, excuse me, but it used to feel like they were two separate boxes, right? And I feel like lately, the last couple of years, they're kind of the
Yeah.
same box now, right? Um,
There's there's a lot of overlap, indeed. If you think back, the North Korean threat actors, there's some destabilization. There's also the financial gain. If you think about Lazarus, the
yep,
attack they carried out in Bangladesh, right? Destabilization, yeah, but also the financial gain. So definitely, even at the state level, there's some overlap. Everybody wants to do a little bit of everything, you could say, right? And especially, with allegedly threat actors from Russia, Fancy Bear, for instance, and others affiliated with the GRU, the magnitude of the attacks and the destabilization, impacted electrical grid infrastructures,
yep,
meddling with elections. That's not a DDoS against, the government website for 10 minutes. That's of another scale.
for
So,
sure.
you know, one can understand why everybody's a little bit on the edge, right?
For sure. And I think it's important to talk about how this is having a very real impact on the
Yes.
ground as well too. And what I'm thinking of here is um, in the U.S., Kaspersky will no longer be allowed to be
Yeah.
sold within the U.S. And to my knowledge, this is the very first instance of something like this happening in the U.S. where hey, you have this security vendor that's been around for years and years and years. Well, you're not allowed to operate within the US anymore, right? And I know
Yeah.
I think there's been some similar stuff in China, if I remember correctly. And folks that listen to the show know my memory is not typically the greatest, but if I remember correctly, um, Cisco is not allowed to be deployed within China for government use because
Yeah.
they're afraid of very much the same thing that the US is afraid of with Kaspersky software, right? So it's that geopolitical side of things impacting business at a more individual level, right?
Yeah. And if you flip the switch, you have in Germany and in France, for instance, some, I guess, strong conversation that could lead to a ban on Huawei. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it
Yeah.
correctly,
Yep.
on 5G devices. So, yeah, as you were saying, the geopolitical implications. They have some impacts in the digital world. They have some impact in the physical world, and everybody's trying to, uh, playing it safe as much as they can. But it's a complex environment to navigate. I guess to our audience, if you're in MSP, if you're in IT and Min, those are also have some real implications for your own end users, your own end clients because of the threats that you might be receiving. And those, some of the starting points are those like major global events. They do have some local repercussions, which are very tangible.
For sure. I mean, it's been many years since I've run into an install of Kaspersky myself, but I can only imagine that there are MSPs that are out there that are now trying to figure out like, okay, what do we pivot
Yeah,
to? Like, what are we going to switch to? And now they're having to plan migrations because of something that is completely out of their control, right? And so
yeah, yeah.
there is a tangible real world impact to all of this, of course. And so I guess that leads me to what I want to wrap the show up with in the couple minutes we have left here, right? And that is like, okay, this is all interesting, right? And it all has an impact on everyday life in some way, shape, or form. But what are we supposed to
Hmm.
do about this? Well,
Yeah.
from a geopolitical standpoint, I'm not sure there's much that you or I or any one
Indeed.
person can do about that. But from a security perspective,
Yes.
I start thinking about certain things. And I kind of have the same opinion of this that I do of the whole AI discussion around cybersecurity is like, oh, hey, there's this new crazy attack thing going on. What are we supposed to do? Right. In the case of AI and in the case of this, I'm not sure it changes the equation for what we do from a cybersecurity perspective. We still want to follow cybersecurity best practices. We still want to train our end users. We still want to watch the common attack vectors. We want to
Hmm.
make sure we're spotting and checking email, right? I've seen it happen time and time again, and maybe you've seen this too, Roman, is where you'll have a given organization, they get laser focused on this really strange, weird, and unique threat vector over here. Like they're worried about malicious code being injected into some homegrown application, something very
Yeah.
specific, right?
Narrow. Yeah.
Meanwhile, MFA is not enabled on any of their
Yeah.
accounts. Right. I mean, they leave the front door open while they're laser
Yeah.
focused on this one little weird thing over here. My point being, don't forget about the cybersecurity basics. Yes, there are more
Mm.
threats today going on because of this and a lot of other factors, right? But I don't think it changes the way that we handle and conduct our security best practices. You got to make sure you're doing those security best practices, watch the front door, um,
Yes.
and just, be aware, train your end users. And I've been saying that this is like my go to saying lately. For God's sakes, take a backup. Take a backup,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so I don't know
Yeah.
if you have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of what I look at from a what do we do perspective, right? It doesn't change our
No.
strategy, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's a good call you're making because that's we always get hyped up, I guess, when we're talking about these really like major event, major breaches, major hacks, because in a way we're fascinated by the complexity, the scale of these attacks. But I think you're right. It's good, especially if you're an SMB, if you're an MSP, to go back to the basics and make sure those are set, and then only then potentially look to the next stage. And so talking about the Olympics specifically, as this is our topic, and
Right.
even if we're opening the door, like we're talking about elections coming up, I think is important is making sure that when we have those conversation, with the customers, once again, if you're an MSP or with the end users, they have the context in mind. Because one thing we're seeing for sure is the use of the ongoing event, the context as a backdrop of cyber
Right.
attacks, right? So we were joking earlier about the ticket scam. A lot of them, they're really rough, right? Not well designed, but you have some more refined attacks. Like they're going to target, for instance, a city hosting the Olympics, a particular event, or if you think about the election, they could target, a city hall workers about the upcoming election organization, things like that. So I
Right.
think it's about making people aware of the context without going necessarily too much into the details, just to know there will be some attacks using that context in particular, because that's a trend we're seeing coming from the cyber
Right.
cyber attacks.
I think that's fantastic advice, and that's a good point that you bring up. Is context is important, and I have this exact discussion quite frequently around tax season here in the U.S. Right, because people are trying to get their
Mm,
taxes done. They're using things like DocuSign more frequently. They're using financial services more frequently. So, like,
yes,
I tell my folks, my parents, be very wary of DocuSign links
yes,
always, but especially right now, right?
yeah.
And
And
so that
and same with e-commerce websites when it's Black Friday, right? We
yes,
see like the
exactly.
the peak in terms of phishing, impersonating some well-known brand, right? It's right at the time. So I agree, 100% agree with you on that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll have to keep an eye on the games here, not only from a
Yep.
Olympics perspective, just to watch the spectacle of it, but from a cybersecurity perspective, we'll kind of keep an eye on it. And if hopefully nothing happens, but if something does, maybe we have
Yeah.
a second episode, right? So just to kind of
Who knows?
take a look at that, but we'll
Hopefully
see.
not then. Yeah.
Hopefully
Yeah.
not, right? Hopefully not. Yes, exactly. So anyway, Ramon, I want to thank you for spending some time with us today to kind of share your well, I should say, very localized knowledge of the Olympic Games this year.
Thanks,
And
Andy. Sure.
best of luck to to France, and hopefully we have some good games here. So looking forward to it. And again, thanks for joining
Yeah.
us today.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Yeah, definitely. Those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us today. If you found value in today's episode and you're watching on the YouTubes, be sure to hit, what do they say? Smash that like and subscribe button, right? And of course, if you're watching, if you're more of an audio only type of listener, you can find us on all the major podcasting platforms. So chances are, depending on where you consume your content, you can find us. If you have more information on Hornet Security, you can go to hornetsecurity.com. But with that, we'll let you get back to your day. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. You know, I almost made it 35-ish minutes without flubbing, but there's my screw up for the episode. Thanks for watching, folks. Appreciate it. Stay safe out there. We'll catch you next week.